morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Betty Johnson stepped out of her small blue house. At 73 years old, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to take life one step at a time. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore her favorite purple cardigan over a simple dress. In her weathered hands, she carried a worn leather purse that had seen better days and a piece of paper with her careful handwriting. Betty had been awake since 5 in the morning, planning her day. Today was special because she was finally going to start her community garden project. For months, she had been dreaming about transforming the empty lot next to the community center into something beautiful. A place where neighbors could grow vegetables together, where children could learn about plants, and where people could come together. The city had finally approved her proposal last week, and Betty could hardly contain her excitement. She had spent years teaching 5th grade at the local elementary school before retiring, and this garden felt like her chance to keep teaching in a different way. She wanted to show people that even a small space could bloom with the right care and attention. Walking down the sidewalk, Betty smiled at the familiar sights of her neighborhood. She had lived here for over 40 years, watching as families moved in and out as children grew up and started families of their own. The neighborhood had changed over the years, but Betty had stayed, becoming like a grandmother to many of the local kids. Mrs. Rodriguez waved from her front porch where she was watering her flowers. Betty waved back, remembering how she had helped Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter with math homework just last month. A few houses down, old Mr. Chen was tending to his roses, and he looked up to give Betty a friendly nod. These were her people, her community, and she couldn't wait to create something special for all of them. Wilson's hardware store sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, its green awning slightly faded but still welcoming. Betty had been shopping there for more than 20 years. She remembered when Mr. Wilson first opened the store, how excited he had been to serve the neighborhood. The store had been passed down to his daughter a few years back, but Betty still thought of it as Mr. Wilson's place. The bell above the door chimed softly as Betty pushed it open. The familiar smell of wood, metal, and paint filled her nose. She loved that smell. It reminded her of possibility, of projects waiting to be started, of dreams ready to take shape. The store wasn't very big, but it was packed with everything a person could need for home improvement or gardening. Betty pulled out her list and smiled. She had written everything down in her neat teacher's handwriting, organized by sections of the store. Screws and bolts, plant stakes, fertilizer, seeds, and a few small tools. She had saved up for months to buy everything on this list, carefully setting aside a few dollars here and there from her modest retirement check. She started in the hardware section, moving slowly between the tall shelves. Her arthritis made it hard to reach the higher shelves, but she was patient. Betty had learned long ago that rushing never helped anything. She found the screws she needed for building raised garden beds and carefully counted out the right amount. Every penny mattered on her fixed income. In the gardening section, Betty felt like a kid in a candy store. There were so many seed packets, each one promising something wonderful: tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, beans. She picked up each packet, reading the planting instructions carefully. Some seeds would need to be started indoors first. Others could go directly in the ground. Betty made mental notes, already planning the layout of her garden. An older gentleman was looking at lawnmowers near the back of the store. A young mother with 2 small children was examining paint samples, the kids asking endless questions about colors. Betty smiled, remembering her own classroom full of curious children always wanting to know why and how about everything. The fertilizer bags were heavy, and Betty struggled a bit to lift one into her cart. A teenage boy nearby noticed and offered to help, which warmed her heart. Young people got a bad reputation sometimes, but Betty had spent her career working with kids. She knew most of them were good, just trying to figure out their place in the world. As she made her way through the store, Betty found herself daydreaming about the garden. She could picture Mrs. Rodriguez's granddaughter learning to plant seeds, Mr. Chen sharing his knowledge about roses, families gathering for a harvest festival in the fall. The garden would bring people together in a way that was becoming rare these days. Betty also thought about the children from the local elementary school. She had already spoken with the current principal about bringing classes to visit the garden. Kids needed to understand where food came from, needed to get their hands dirty and watch things grow. In a world full of screens and instant everything, gardens taught patience and care. The plant stakes were exactly what she needed, sturdy but not too expensive. Betty was careful with money, but she also knew that buying cheap materials often meant having to replace them later. She wanted this garden to last, to become a permanent part of the community. As she continued shopping, Betty noticed the young man behind the counter. He looked to be in his early 20s, wearing a store uniform that seemed a bit too big for him. He was focused on his phone, not paying much attention to the customers coming and going. Betty had seen him here a few times before, but they had never really talked. Betty remembered her first years of teaching, how nervous she had been, how much she had to learn about working with people. Everyone deserved patience and understanding, especially young people just starting their careers. She made a mental note to be extra kind when she checked out. With her cart finally full, Betty made her way toward the front of the store. She was tired but happy, excited to start bringing her garden vision to life. Tomorrow she would begin preparing the soil. Next week she would start planting. By summer the empty lot would be green and growing, full of life and possibility. Betty looked at her list one more time, checking off each item. Everything was there, everything she needed to start something beautiful. She had no idea that this ordinary Tuesday afternoon was about to become anything but ordinary. She had no way of knowing that her simple trip to the hardware store would change everything, not just for her but for everyone involved. As she approached the checkout counter, Betty felt nothing but hope and anticipation for the project ahead. Betty wheeled her cart up to the checkout counter, her face bright with the satisfaction of a shopping trip well done. She had found everything on her list and stayed within her careful budget. The young cashier, whose name tag read Tyler, was still looking at his phone, his thumb scrolling through what appeared to be social media posts. "Excuse me," Betty said politely, beginning to unload her items onto the counter. Tyler looked up with obvious annoyance, as if Betty had interrupted something very important. He was a thin young man with messy brown hair and a permanent scowl that seemed to be his default expression. Tyler began scanning items without saying a word, not even a simple greeting. Betty didn't let his rudeness dampen her spirits. She had dealt with difficult people throughout her teaching career, and had learned that sometimes people were just having a bad day. "Beautiful weather we're having," Betty commented, trying to make friendly conversation. Tyler grunted something that might have been agreement but didn't look up from his scanning. The machine beeped with each item, creating a rhythm that filled the awkward silence. When Tyler scanned the fertilizer, the price seemed higher than Betty remembered from the advertisement she had seen in the store window. She had specifically chosen this brand because it was on sale, part of a spring gardening promotion. "I think there might be a mistake," Betty said gently, pointing to the display on the register. "The fertilizer was advertised as being on sale for $15, but it's showing up as $22. Tyler stopped scanning and looked at her with clear irritation. "That's the price," he said flatly, not bothering to check anything. "Well, I saw the sign in your front window," Betty explained patiently. "It said all spring fertilizers were marked down 25%. I chose this one specifically because of that sale." Tyler rolled his eyes dramatically. "Look, lady, I don't know anything about any sale. The computer says $22, so that's what it costs. Take it or leave it." Betty felt a little flutter of discomfort in her chest, but she maintained her composure. She had saved exactly enough money for her shopping list, including the advertised discounts. The extra $7 would throw off her entire budget. "Could you please just check with your manager?" Betty asked politely. "I'm sure it's just a simple computer error. The sign is right there in the window." Tyler's face darkened. "Are you calling me a liar?" His voice was getting louder, and Betty noticed the other customers in the store beginning to turn their heads toward the commotion. "Oh no, not at all," Betty said quickly, raising her hands in a peaceful gesture. "I just think there might be a miscommunication somewhere. These things happen all the time." "Listen here," Tyler snapped, leaning forward aggressively. "I've been working here for 6 months and I know how to do my job. If you can't afford to shop here, maybe you should try the dollar store down the street." Betty felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The other customers were definitely watching now, and she could feel their eyes on her. She had never been spoken to like this in a store before, especially not at Wilson's Hardware, where she had been a loyal customer for decades. "I can afford to shop here," Betty said quietly, trying to keep her dignity intact. "I've been shopping here for over 20 years. I just want to make sure I'm being charged the correct price." Tyler laughed, but there was no humor in it. 20 years? Yeah, right. Look, lady, I don't have time for this nonsense. Either buy your stuff or get out of the way so I can help real customers. The words hit Betty like a physical blow. Real customers? What did that mean? She looked around at the other people in the store, noticing for the first time how they were all looking at her. Some seemed sympathetic, but others appeared uncomfortable, as if they wanted her to just give up and leave. I would really appreciate it if you could just call your manager, Betty repeated, her voice starting to shake slightly. This is a simple matter that could be resolved in just a minute. Tyler slammed his hand down on the counter, making Betty jump. Stop being so difficult. You're holding up the line and causing problems for everyone else. Can't you see people are waiting? Betty glanced behind her and saw that indeed 2 other customers had lined up behind her cart. She felt terrible about keeping them waiting, but she also knew she was right about the sale price. She had read the advertisement carefully 3 times before coming to the store. Please, she said one more time. Could you just check the sale advertisement? I promise I'm not trying to cause trouble. That's when Tyler stepped out from behind the counter. He was taller than Betty, and suddenly he seemed very large and intimidating as he moved closer to her. Betty instinctively took a step back, her heart beginning to race. You know what your problem is? Tyler said, his voice getting louder with each word. You people always think you deserve special treatment. You come in here acting like you own the place, making demands, causing scenes. Betty's mouth fell open in shock. You people? The words hung in the air like a slap. She suddenly understood that this wasn't really about the fertilizer price or even about customer service. This was about something much deeper and more hurtful. I don't understand, Betty whispered, though part of her understood all too well. You understand perfectly, Tyler continued, his anger seeming to feed on itself. Coming in here with your attitude, questioning everything, making me look bad in front of other customers. I'm sick of it. Tyler reached out and grabbed Betty's arm, his fingers digging into her thin skin through her cardigan. Betty gasped in pain and shock as he pulled her toward the door. You need to leave right now, he said through gritted teeth. Take your troublemaking somewhere else. Betty tried to pull her arm free, but Tyler's grip was too strong. She could feel tears starting to form in her eyes, partly from the physical pain but mostly from the humiliation and shock of what was happening. Please, she said, her voice barely audible. You're hurting me. The other customers in the store had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching, but no one was stepping forward to help. Betty felt more alone than she had in years, standing in a store where she had been a welcome customer for decades, being manhandled by someone young enough to be her grandson. Let go of me, Betty said more firmly, finding some strength in her voice. I haven't done anything wrong. But Tyler wasn't listening. He was caught up in his own anger now, pulling her toward the door while she struggled to keep her balance. Betty's purse fell from her shoulder, and her carefully written shopping list fluttered to the floor. Just then, the sound of a door opening came from the back of the store. Heavy footsteps approached quickly, and a woman's voice called out sharply, What in the world is going on out here? The voice that cut through the tension belonged to Rosa Wilson, the store owner. She had been in her back office reviewing inventory reports when she heard raised voices from the front of the store. At first, she thought it might just be customers discussing a project. But as the voices got louder and more aggressive, she knew she needed to investigate. Rosa was a 45-year-old woman with kind eyes and graying hair that she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had inherited the hardware store from her father 3 years ago and took great pride in maintaining the reputation he had built for fair dealing and excellent customer service. As Rosa rounded the corner and saw Tyler gripping an elderly woman's arm, her blood ran cold. The scene before her was everything she stood against, everything her father had taught her never to tolerate in their store. Tyler, Rosa's voice cracked like a whip across the silent store. Let go of that woman immediately. Tyler released Betty's arm so quickly that she stumbled backward, catching herself against a display of garden hoses. Rosa rushed forward to steady her, her face a mixture of concern and barely controlled anger. Ma'am, are you all right? Rosa asked gently, helping Betty regain her balance. Did he hurt you? Betty rubbed her arm where Tyler had grabbed her, red marks already beginning to show on her pale skin. She was shaking, whether from shock, anger, or pain. Rosa couldn't tell. I'm okay, Betty said quietly, though she clearly wasn't. I was just trying to ask about a sale price, and he got upset. Rosa's eyes flashed as she turned to look at Tyler, who was now standing behind the counter looking defiant rather than ashamed. She had hired him 6 months ago against her better judgment, mainly because she felt sorry for him. He had been out of work for a while and claimed he really needed the job. Now she was seeing a side of him that made her stomach turn. What exactly happened here? Rosa demanded, her voice stern but controlled. Tyler crossed his arms defensively. She was being difficult, arguing about prices, holding up the line. I was just trying to handle the situation. By putting your hands on a customer? Rosa's voice rose slightly and she had to take a deep breath to keep from shouting. By physically grabbing an elderly woman? She wouldn't listen. Tyler mumbled, no longer meeting Rosa's eyes. Rosa turned back to Betty, studying her face more carefully. There was something familiar about this woman, something that tugged at the edge of Rosa's memory. The kind eyes, the gentle way she spoke despite what had just happened to her, the dignity she maintained even in this awful situation. I'm so sorry this happened, Rosa said to Betty. This is absolutely not how we treat customers in my store. Can you tell me your name? Betty Johnson, she replied, still rubbing her arm. The name hit Rosa like a lightning bolt. Betty Johnson. Mrs. Johnson. Images came flooding back from Rosa's childhood, memories she hadn't thought about in years. A classroom with bright bulletin boards, the smell of chalk and pencil shavings, and a teacher who had changed her life in ways she was only now beginning to understand. Rosa's hands began to shake as the memories became clearer. She was 8 years old again, sitting in the back of Mrs. Johnson's 5th grade classroom. Her family had been struggling financially that year. Her father was working 2 jobs to keep the hardware store afloat, and her mother was cleaning houses to bring in extra money. Rosa had been wearing the same 3 outfits to school over and over, and some of the other kids had started to notice and make comments. Mrs. Johnson had never said anything directly, but Rosa remembered how she would often find extra supplies in her desk, new pencils, erasers, notebooks that Mrs. Johnson claimed were extras from previous years. More importantly, Mrs. Johnson had made Rosa feel smart and capable when everything else in her life felt uncertain and difficult. But the memory that nearly brought Rosa to her knees was what happened near the end of that school year. Rosa's family had been facing eviction from their small apartment. The hardware store wasn't making enough money yet, and they had fallen behind on rent. Rosa remembered the fear in her parents' faces, the whispered conversations late at night, the terrible possibility that they might have to leave their neighborhood and start over somewhere else. Then something miraculous had happened. Mrs. Johnson had somehow learned about their situation, and she had organized a community fundraiser. Rosa remembered the night of the event, held in the school gymnasium, with neighbors and friends contributing whatever they could. Mrs. Johnson had donated anonymously, but Rosa's mother had found out later that their teacher had given a significant portion of her own salary to help them. That money had saved Rosa's family. It allowed them to keep their apartment and gave her father the breathing room he needed to build the hardware store into a successful business. Everything Rosa had now, everything her family had built, could be traced back to the kindness of the woman standing in front of her. Rosa felt tears starting to form in her eyes as she looked at Betty Johnson, now 73 years old, who had just been assaulted in the very store that existed because of her generosity. Mrs. Johnson, Rosa said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you remember Rosa Alvarez? You were my 5th grade teacher at Riverside Elementary. Betty's eyes widened as she looked more closely at Rosa's face. Slowly, recognition dawned in her features and a small smile appeared despite everything that had just happened. Rosa? Little Rosa Alvarez? Betty's voice was filled with wonder. Oh my goodness, look at you. I heard you had taken over the store. I should have made the connection. Mrs. Johnson, Rosa said, her voice breaking slightly. You saved my family when I was a child. Do you remember? The fundraiser at the school? Betty's face softened with the memory. Of course I remember. Your parents were such good people, working so hard to build something for your family. Rosa could barely speak now as the full weight of what had just happened hit her. The woman who had saved her family, who had given her the chance at the life she now lived, had just been humiliated and physically assaulted in her store by her employee, Tyler. Meanwhile, was beginning to realize that this conversation had taken a very serious turn. He could see that Rosa was deeply upset, and he was starting to understand that this wasn't just about customer service anymore. "Mrs. Johnson," Rosa said, taking Betty's hands in hers, "I cannot express how sorry I am about what just happened. This is unacceptable on every level." Betty squeezed Rosa's hands gently. "It's not your fault, dear. You couldn't have known." But Rosa shook her head firmly. "It is my responsibility. This is my store, and this happened under my roof." "Tyler," she said, turning to face her employee with a look that could have melted steel, "you're fired. Effective immediately." Tyler's mouth dropped open. "What? Rosa, come on, it wasn't that big a deal. I was just trying to handle a difficult customer." "Get out," Rosa said quietly, but her voice carried absolute authority. "Clean out your locker and leave. I never want to see you in this store again." As Tyler realized she was serious, his defiance crumbled. "Wait, please, I need this job. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't mean anything by it." "Yes, you did," Rosa replied. "And now you have to live with the consequences." Tyler stood frozen behind the counter, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally panic, as the reality of Rosa's words sank in. He had expected maybe a write-up or a warning, but being fired on the spot was something he hadn't seen coming. "Rosa, please," Tyler pleaded, his earlier aggression completely gone now. "I've been working here for 6 months. I need this job to pay my rent. Can't we just talk about this?" Rosa's expression remained firm and unmoved. "There's nothing to talk about, Tyler. You physically grabbed an elderly customer because she asked about a sale price. You used language that was completely inappropriate and unprofessional. This isn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This is who you chose to be today." The other customers in the store were still watching the scene unfold, some with their phones out, though Rosa couldn't tell if they were recording or just nervously fidgeting. She made a mental note to check if anyone had captured video of Tyler's behavior, not because she was worried about bad publicity, but because it might be useful if Mrs. Johnson decided to press charges. "Mrs. Johnson," Rosa said, turning her full attention back to Betty, "I want to call the police. What Tyler did to you was assault, and it's not okay. He needs to face consequences for his actions." Betty looked surprised at the suggestion. "Oh, I don't know if that's necessary. He's just a young man who made a mistake." "No," Rosa said gently but firmly. "This wasn't a mistake. A mistake is giving someone the wrong change or forgetting to apply a discount. What he did was deliberate and wrong, and you don't deserve to brush it off just to make things easier for him." Tyler's face went pale. "Assault? Come on, I barely touched her. This is getting way out of hand." Rosa whipped around to face him again. "You grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks. You physically forced her toward the door against her will. In what world is that not assault?" While they were talking, Betty had quietly picked up her shopping list from where it had fallen on the floor. Rosa noticed the careful handwriting, the way each item was listed with its estimated price. She could see that Betty had planned the shopping trip down to the penny, and she felt a fresh wave of anger at Tyler for disrupting something that had clearly been important to her. "What were you shopping for today, Mrs. Johnson?" Rosa asked, her voice returning to its gentle tone. Betty's face lit up despite everything that had happened. "I'm starting a community garden project. The city approved my proposal to use the empty lot next to the community center. I've been planning it for months." Rosa felt her heart swell with pride and affection for her former teacher. Of course Mrs. Johnson was starting a community garden. Of course she was finding ways to keep helping people even in retirement. It was exactly the kind of thing the woman who had saved Rosa's family would do. "That sounds wonderful," Rosa said sincerely. "Tell me about it." As Betty described her vision for the garden, Rosa could see the passion and excitement in her eyes. This was clearly something that meant everything to her, and Tyler had nearly ruined what should have been a happy day of preparation. Rosa pulled out her phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, she clearly and calmly reported the assault, providing her store's address and explaining that she was the owner and witness to the incident. Tyler's panic increased as he heard Rosa talking to the police. "This is insane. I'm not waiting around for this." He started to move toward the door, but Rosa's voice stopped him. "If you leave before the police get here, it's only going to make things worse for you," she said. "Running away won't change what you did." Tyler hesitated, then slumped back against the counter, defeated. He seemed to finally understand that this situation was completely out of his control now. While they waited for the police, Rosa rang up Betty's items personally, making sure to apply the correct sale price for the fertilizer and adding a few additional discounts that she created on the spot. "Mrs. Johnson, everything in your cart today is free," Rosa announced. Betty immediately protested. "Oh no, dear, that's not necessary. I can afford to pay for my things." "I know you can," Rosa replied, "but I want to do this. You're starting a community garden that's going to benefit everyone in the neighborhood. Consider this my contribution to the project." Betty's eyes filled with tears, but these were different tears than the ones from her earlier distress. These were tears of gratitude and relief. "You know," Betty said softly, "I was starting to wonder if I was too old for this garden project. If maybe I was being foolish to think I could make a difference. What happened today with Tyler made me feel so small and helpless." Rosa felt anger surge through her again. Not just at Tyler, but at the thought that this wonderful woman might have given up on her project because of one person's cruelty. "You are not too old. And you are definitely not foolish," Rosa said firmly. "You've been making a difference your whole life. You made a difference in mine when I was 8 years old. And you're going to make a difference with this garden." The police arrived 15 minutes later, 2 officers who took statements from everyone involved. Tyler tried to minimize what had happened, claiming it was just a misunderstanding, but the red marks on Betty's arm told a different story. The other customers in the store corroborated Rosa's account of what they had witnessed. Officer Martinez, the lead officer, was gentle but thorough in his questioning of Betty. He explained her options for pressing charges and made it clear that the decision was entirely up to her. "I've seen cases like this before," he told her privately. "Sometimes people think they can get away with treating others badly because they don't expect consequences. If you don't press charges, he might think what he did was okay." Betty considered this carefully. She wasn't a vindictive person, but she thought about other elderly people who might shop here, other people who might not have Rosa to defend them. "I'll press charges," she decided. Not out of anger, but because it's the right thing to do. Tyler was arrested and taken away in handcuffs, still protesting that everyone was overreacting. As the police car pulled away, Rosa felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness that it had come to this. Relief that Tyler would face consequences for his actions. The store had emptied out during all the commotion, leaving Rosa and Betty alone together. Rosa locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, deciding that some things were more important than business hours. "Mrs. Johnson," Rosa said, "would you like to sit down for a minute? I'd love to hear more about your garden project." As they sat together in the quiet store, surrounded by the tools and supplies that represented both women's dreams and hard work, Rosa felt the weight of how interconnected their lives had been. Mrs. Johnson had saved Rosa's family when she was a child, and now Rosa had the chance to support Mrs. Johnson's new project. It wasn't really about paying back a debt, Rosa realized. It was about how kindness spreads from person to person, creating a web of support that could last for decades. 3 days after the incident at the hardware store, Rosa drove through the quiet streets toward Betty's house. In the back of her truck were all the gardening supplies from Betty's original shopping list, plus several additional items that Rosa thought might be useful for the community garden project. She had also brought something else, a proposal that had been keeping her awake at night with excitement. Betty's house was exactly what Rosa had expected, small but well-maintained, with flower boxes under the windows and a tiny front garden that showed the loving care of someone who understood plants. Rosa smiled as she noticed the precise rows of vegetables and the way every plant seemed to be thriving. When Betty answered the door, she looked much better than she had 3 days ago. The shock and hurt from Tyler's attack had faded, replaced by her natural warmth and energy. She was wearing gardening clothes and had dirt under her fingernails, which told Rosa that she hadn't let the incident stop her from moving forward with her plans. "Rosa, what a wonderful surprise," Betty said, opening the door wide. "Please come in." Betty's living room was cozy and filled with the kind of furniture that had been carefully chosen and lovingly maintained over many years. The walls were covered with photographs, students from her decades of teaching, family members, and community events. Rosa could see certificates and awards that Betty had received for her service to education and the community. "I brought your supplies," Rosa said, "plus a few extra things I thought you might need." "You didn't have to do that," Betty protested. But Rosa could see she was pleased. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something bigger," Rosa said, settling into the comfortable chair Betty offered her. I have an idea about your garden project. Betty poured tea from a flowered pot and sat down across from Rosa, her eyes bright with curiosity. I've been thinking, Rosa began, about what you said about the community garden bringing people together, about kids learning where food comes from, and neighbors working side by side. It sounds like exactly what this neighborhood needs. Betty nodded enthusiastically. That's been my dream. I've seen how separated people have become, how children spend all their time indoors with screens. I want to create a space where families can connect with each other and with the earth. Rosa leaned forward. I want Wilson's Hardware to be the official sponsor of your community garden. Betty's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Sponsor? I want to provide all the supplies you need, not just for getting started, but for maintaining the garden long term. Seeds, tools, fertilizer, everything. I also want to set up a special section in the store just for community garden supplies, where people can get advice and materials for their own projects. Betty set down her teacup with trembling hands. Rosa, that's incredibly generous, but I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, Rosa said with a smile. I'm offering. Mrs. Johnson, when I was 8 years old, you and the community came together to save my family. Now I'm in a position to help bring the community together again. It feels like everything has come full circle. Betty's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Rosa laughed. Say you'll let me help you create something beautiful. Over the next hour, they spread Betty's garden plans across the coffee table and discussed every detail. Rosa's business knowledge, combined with Betty's educational experience and gardening expertise, created a powerful partnership. They talked about involving the local elementary school, organizing volunteer days, and creating educational programs for children and adults. Rosa also shared some news that she had been saving. I've been thinking about what happened with Tyler, and I realized that I need to make some changes at the store. I'm implementing new hiring practices and mandatory training for all employees about customer service and treating people with respect. That's wonderful, Betty said. But you know, Tyler isn't a bad person. He's just young and angry about something. People his age sometimes feel like the world has left them behind. Rosa was amazed by Betty's compassion. Even after what Tyler had done to her, she was trying to understand his perspective. I actually got a letter from him yesterday, Rosa continued. He's in jail for now, waiting for his court date, but he wrote to apologize. Not just to me, but to you. He asked me to give you this. Rosa pulled an envelope from her purse. Betty opened it carefully and read the handwritten letter inside. Tyler's words were simple but seemed sincere. He acknowledged that what he had done was wrong, admitted that his anger had been misdirected, and expressed genuine remorse for hurting her. He's asked if he can volunteer at the community garden when he gets out, Betty said, looking up from the letter. As a way to make amends, Rosa shook her head in amazement. Would you actually consider that? Betty was quiet for a moment, thinking. I think people deserve second chances, especially young people. If he's truly sorry and willing to learn, then yes, I'd consider it. Gardens are good places for people to grow and change. As the afternoon turned to evening, Rosa helped Betty load the gardening supplies into her garage. They made plans to visit the garden site together the next day and to meet with the city planners to discuss the expanded project that Rosa's sponsorship would make possible. Word of the community garden and Wilson's Hardware. Sponsorship spread quickly through the neighborhood. Within a week, Betty had a list of 20 families who wanted to participate. The local elementary school's principal called to arrange field trips. The community center offered to host planning meetings and a harvest festival in the fall. Mrs. Rodriguez, from down the street, stopped by to offer her expertise with composting. Mr. Chen brought over starter plants from his own garden. The teenager who had helped Betty with the heavy fertilizer bag showed up with 3 of his friends, all eager to volunteer. 2 months later, the empty lot next to the community center had been transformed. Raised beds created organized growing spaces. Pathways allowed easy access for people with mobility challenges, and a small greenhouse provided space for starting seeds and educational programs. Rosa stood at the edge of the garden on a warm Saturday morning, watching Betty lead a group of children on a tour of the growing plants. The kids were fascinated by everything: how tomatoes grew on vines, why some plants needed more water than others, and how earthworms helped make the soil healthy. The garden had become more than just a place to grow food. It had become a gathering place for the community, Families worked together on weekend mornings, sharing stories and advice. Elderly residents shared their knowledge with young parents. Children who had never seen vegetables grow now understood the connection between the earth and their dinner tables. Tyler had been released from jail the month before, sentenced to community service and mandatory anger management classes. True to his letter, he had approached Betty about volunteering at the garden. She had agreed, with the condition that he start slowly and prove his commitment. Rosa watched as Tyler worked quietly in one corner of the garden, pulling weeds under the supervision of Mr. Chen. The young man who had been so angry and aggressive was now learning patience and gentleness from a 78-year-old man who spoke broken English but communicated perfectly through kindness. Betty appeared at Rosa's side, both women watching the busy garden with satisfaction. "You know," Betty said, "I used to think that teaching was my greatest accomplishment. 40 years in the classroom, helping children learn to read and think and grow. But this garden has taught me something new." "What's that?" Rosa asked. "That teaching never really stops. It just changes form. These children are learning, Tyler is learning, all of us are learning from each other. The classroom was just the beginning." Rosa nodded, thinking about her own journey from a struggling 8-year-old to a successful business owner to a community partner. Every step had been connected to the one before it, all leading to this moment. As the morning sun climbed higher, the garden came alive with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the quiet satisfaction of people working together to create something beautiful. Betty's dream of bringing the community together had become reality, but it had also become something bigger than she had ever imagined. The empty lot was gone, replaced by abundance. But more importantly, the isolation and disconnection that had crept into the neighborhood was being replaced by friendship, understanding, and hope. And at the center of it all was a 73-year-old retired teacher who had refused to let one person's cruelty stop her from believing in the goodness of people and the power of second chances.